Very, very top. Ladies and gentlemen, live from the Four Corners of Freedom in Kingston, New York, Judge Andrew Paisano Napolitano.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all know those iconic words written by Thomas Jefferson in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence promulgated in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. How did we get there, and where are we today? The British king and his parliament were desperate for cash and decided they would impose a tax on the colonists, and they would call it the Stamp Act. So every piece of paper in your possession in your home, every letter, every book, every pamphlet, every poster to be nailed to a tree had to have the king's stamp on it. Where did you get the stamp? You went to the king's post office in every colony, including where we are now. Question: how did the king and the parliament 3,000 miles away know if you had stamps on the papers in your home? Answer: the Writs of Assistance Act. This abominable piece of legislation permitted British soldiers to knock on the door of your house and search for whatever they wanted and seize whatever they found, ostensibly looking for the stamps. The acts were so unpopular that even Parliament rescinded them after a year and a half, but the damage was done. The American colonists had had enough of the king crossing the threshold, because some very bright students at the College of New Jersey, now called Princeton, did some math and figured out that it cost the government more to enforce the Stamp Act than they collected in revenue. Well, now the king was a dope, but how stupid could you be to impose a tax that costs more to collect than you're actually collecting in revenue, unless the purpose of the tax was not to collect money. It was to remind the colonists that he was still their king, and he could, through his agents and soldiers, enter their home on a whim or a pretext whenever he wanted, and he did. 10 years later, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and those iconic words that with which I began this talk became a mantra that the colonists, now Americans, would recite aloud on every street corner and every town square, including in this beautiful town of Kingston, where much of the arguments for American freedom were born. We fought a revolution. We won the revolution. We wrote a constitution. The purpose of the Constitution was to assure that what the king and the parliament did to the colonists, the new government in America would not be able to do to Americans. We know that it failed. So the stories that I will tell you are generally and genuinely not happy ones. But if we draw a lesson from what we have allowed the government to do to us, as Gerald was saying a few minutes ago, how did the German people let that happen? How did we let the government stifle our freedom in every state in the Union in the past 18 months? When we wrote the Constitution, the elites knew that the public would never accept it unless the Bill of Rights was added. So the Constitution is written in 1787, ratified in 1789. In 1791, the Bill of Rights is added. And the Bill of Rights, if you go through it, as I will in a moment, articulates natural rights, freedom that comes from our humanity and not from the government. So the First Amendment doesn't grant the freedom of speech. Our humanity is integral to the freedom of speech. The First Amendment restrains the government from interfering with the freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law infringing upon the freedom of speech or of the press. The First Amendment, of course, also stands for the separation of state and church. That's not enough separation. How about the separation of state from the economy? How about the separation of the state from land? How about the separation of the state from our beliefs and our words? How about the separation of the state from the war and military? How about the separation of the state from our personal liberty in our once free society?
Yeah.
Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. And my friends, it was not written to protect the right to shoot deer. It was written to protect the right to shoot at tyrants.
Yeah.
They take over the government. The Fourth Amendment is the quintessentially American right. The right that civilized human beings value the most. And Gerald just mentioned this in his unique Neapolitan Bronx way. It is the right to be left alone. The right to keep the government outside the threshold of your house and outside your bank account and outside your website and off of your property and outside of your head. All of these rights were written with the presumption that they come from our humanity. Everybody rejoiced when the Bill of Rights was enacted. We finally have a government and we have restraints on the government. The Fifth Amendment prohibits torture, prohibits the government from prosecuting you over and over again as the kings would do. The Ninth Amendment, in my view, is the most important. It was Madison's favorite. It articulates the fact that there are many, many human rights that are not listed in the Bill of Rights. They also are protected. Madison wanted to protect the rights that stem from our humanity. Eight years after the Bill of Rights was enacted, during the presidency of John Adams and the vice presidency of the sainted Thomas Jefferson, and they, of course, didn't speak to each other. I mean, the president and the vice president didn't speak right. Well, do you remember how people were elected in those days? Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Imagine Joe Biden saying to Donald Trump, would you attend this funeral for me? Or Trump saying to Hillary, Hillary, I need you to go to Rome today to pacify the Pope. In that era, there spread throughout the United States something that is inconceivable today. Fear of the French. Well, the French had just cut the king's head off, and the French Revolution was bloodier and more destructive of cultural norms than ours. So the Federalists, the big government characters who ran the government, George Washington, now retired, John Adams, the President of the United States, the Federalists controlling the Congress, enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, what did that do? That made it a crime to speak critically of the president or the government, not the vice president, because Jefferson didn't care what people said about him, and he had them take that language out of there. So the very same people who wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, 10 years later, the very same human beings enacted a statute punishing speech. Now, John Adams had a problem that afflicts a lot of middle-aged men. It was his ever-growing waistline. And Mrs. Adams didn't like the way he looked in the sort of muddy, messy, unpaved roadways of the brand new Washington, D.C. So she sewed for him a purple robe. And then she didn't like the way the robe looked, so she put gold epaulets on the shoulders. And you'd see this this mountain of purple, as wide as he was tall, walking from the White House to the Capitol building, when he was confronted one day with the Ron Paul of that era, Congressman Matthew Lyons of Vermont, who decided to challenge the Alien and Sedition Act. And he referred to John Adams as, "Good morning, your pomposity." Adams didn't like it, but didn't pay too much attention to him. 2 weeks later, with the press in tow, he confronts the rotund, purple-robed, gold-epauletted John Adams and says, "Good morning, your rotundity." And for that, for mocking the president's waistline, this member of Congress was charged under the Alien and Sedition Act with speaking untruthfully about the president. Everybody thought it was a joke, but he was indicted, tried in Boston, 400 miles from the scene of the so-called crime, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years in a federal dungeon in western Massachusetts. And while in prison, he did something rather unique. If you are from Boston, New Orleans, Chicago, or Hudson County, New Jersey, you are familiar with what he did. He ran for re-election from his jail cell, and he won. And when he got out of jail, he and his followers had a triumphal march from western Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. He was planning to confront the rotund John Adams, who put him in jail, when he finds in the White House not this wide as he was tall character with the purple robes, but the tall, thin, red-headed aristocrat who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who proceeded to pardon him, return his 460-acre farm that the government had seized from him to his family, and to celebrate the fact that the Alien and Sedition Acts had expired and freedom could reign yet again. After 9/11, the government enacted a modern-day Alien and Sedition Act, the most abominable, hateful, unconstitutional piece of legislation enacted since the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it was the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, of course, allowed FBI agents to surveil your bank account, your legal files, your medical files, your mail, without a search warrant. And if you found out about it, you were not permitted to tell anyone. You couldn't tell a judge in a courtroom. You couldn't tell your lawyer in the lawyer's office. You couldn't tell your spouse in the bedroom. You couldn't tell a priest in confessional, because the Patriot Act purported to infringe upon the freedom of speech. So the same mentality running the government in 2001 as was running the government in 1796, they all took the same oath to the same Bill of Rights, and they all thumbed their nose to it because they were more interested in controlling human beings than in allowing us to exercise our freedoms. 2 FBI agents walk into a library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a search warrant in which he has authorized the other to search the records of the library. The librarian is an 86-year-old volunteer. She can barely hear them. "What do you want, Sonny?" "Well, I'm an FBI agent and I'm going to search your records." "Oh, don't touch me." No, not you, madam, but the records." "What do you want?" "Here's the search warrant." "Where'd you get it? What judge?" "Oh, no, my fellow FBI agent gave it to me. Under the Patriot Act, one FBI agent, this is a real check on abuse, isn't it? One FBI agent can authorize another FBI agent to search where he wants and seize whatever he finds. The 86-year-old librarian hands it to her 76-year-old volunteer, whereupon she is arrested for telling someone that the FBI was there looking for documents under the Patriot Act. Fast forward a year later, they're in jail, they're in court and about to try this case. And the federal judge says to the prosecutor, "Are you serious? You really want to tell a jury that an 87-year-old partially deaf library volunteer should go to jail because she handed a copy of this so-called search warrant to her colleague?" Yes, that's what the Patriot Act says. Okay, I'm about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to prosecute her? Would you give us a moment to call Attorney General Ashcroft? They call Ashcroft in D.C., who panics and says, "Well, for gosh sakes, dismiss the indictment. Bush will go crazy if the Patriot Act is declared unconstitutional." Well, the judge was wiser than everybody in the room. The feds came back into the courtroom the next day and said, "We're going to move to dismiss the indictment." The judge says, "Very good. But before I dismiss the indictment, here's my opinion declaring the Patriot Act unconstitutional." Did the feds follow her opinion? Answer, no. That opinion is only valid in the District of Connecticut, which is the state of Connecticut, which are the limits of this federal judge's jurisdiction. They continued to have these FBI-written search warrants exercised and enforced throughout the country in utter defiance of the right to be left alone, in utter defiance of the Fourth Amendment, in plain defiance of the Fourth Amendment, which couldn't be clearer, and says, "The people shall be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause, specifically describing the place to be searched and the person or thing to be seized." This mumbo-jumbo nonsense about one FBI agent authorizing another to look wherever they wanted and seize whatever they found is in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. And this prosecuting someone for telling anybody that they have been victimized by the Patriot Act is in direct violation of the First Amendment. So George W. thought he could get around this by using the military. Military? Well, the NSA is in the military. The NSA, the National Security Administration, is America's domestic spying apparatus. What, is there a drone up there? It's a good guy. It's Patrick from Le Canard. It's a good guy. So, the NSA, pursuant to an executive order issued by George W., begins to spy and capture all fiber optic communication in the United States. Every touch on every keyboard, every text message, every email, every telephone conversation, the NSA has captured. There's only 60,000 of these spies. 10% are military, 90% are civilian, in utter and direct violation of the right to be let alone. So what happens to people when they get in the government? Why is it that they take the same oath I did to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, which means all the Bill of Rights, which means all the laws that were written, which means the Declaration of Independence, that our rights are inalienable. Inalienable means they come from our humanity and not from the government. The thing that happens to them is what St. Augustine called libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido, but the lust to dominate, the lust to tell other people how to live, the lust to regulate their property and their economics and their words and their thoughts and their travel. 20 years ago, somebody standing here ranting and raving against the government interfering with our thoughts and our words and our travel might have been considered a madman. 10 years ago, maybe. 2 years ago, perhaps. But we all just lived through this. We all just lived through the most Orwellian period in American history, in which our privacy was invaded, our businesses were shut down, our travel was restricted, our thoughts were suppressed, our ability to worship was interfered with, and our control of our own bodies was invaded by the government. You own your body. You own your face. The government can't tell you what makeup to put on or when to shave or when to cover it with a rag that the government calls a face mask. Your face is yours and not the government's. And you own your arm, and the government can't pierce that arm against your will. No judge can order it. No government can intimidate it. No government-owned school can condition the piercing of your arm as a prerequisite for you and your kids to go to that school. Gerald asked about an hour and a half ago, how did these things happen? They happened because we let them happen. They happened because human beings would opt for safety and security rather than liberty. We all know that one-liner from Ben Franklin. You can recite it in your sleep. Those who would give up essential liberty in order to obtain temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety and will end up with neither. Because when you surrender liberty to the government, in order to allow it to address a crisis, if you accept this nonsense that giving up liberty will somehow keep us safe, and then the crisis passes, do you think the government will give the liberty back? Of course not. People are still arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917, in which Woodrow Wilson arrested people for reciting the Declaration of Independence outside of draft offices and singing German beer hall songs in bars and pubs. And when Wilson was challenged, he said, well, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. I'm not the Congress, I can do this. Wait a minute, the Constitution says only the Congress makes the law. Okay, so Congress will make a law. Whoever shall utter any words detrimental to the security of the free state shall be guilty of a felony. That's the same wording that the Chinese government uses today. That is still the law. Now, in fairness, no one has been successfully prosecuted under the Espionage Act until after the era of World War II. But the law is still on the books, waiting for some monster in the White House to decide to direct the Department of Justice to use the law. My dear friends, Gerald Celente, who brought us here today, is a giant among us because he is literally Celente contra mundum, Celente against the world. We all must be Celentes. We all must stand for the proposition. We all must stand for the proposition that my rights come from my humanity. If you believe in God, as I do, I'm an old-fashioned pre-Vatican II Latin Mass attending Roman Catholic, then it's easy for you to understand that God created us in His image and likeness. As He's perfectly free, we're perfectly free. If you're not of that view, it's easy to understand because we have human reason. And by the exercise of reason, we are the most rational beings on the planet. And our reason tells us that we need freedom in order to exercise that reason to discover the truth. And the truth is, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are
I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. Well, that's the sainted Ronald Reagan, who even he assaulted civil liberties and appointed judges who ignored the Bill of Rights. We need to challenge the government at every turn. We need to deal with people like Andrew Cuomo in New York and Phil Murphy in New Jersey, and these governors who became dictators and despots and tyrants telling us how to live. This is the line, thou shalt not pass. This is my house, you're not entering. This is my business, don't tell me how to run it. This is my church, I'll worship when and where and how I want. And the government should stay out of my face. In small anecdotal conversations with some of the folks in the crowd while I was waiting for Gerald to bring me up here, I know that we are of one mind on this. I also know that we are prepared for things to get worse before they get better. We are a minority, ladies and gentlemen, those who believe in the primacy of freedom. This battle between personal liberty and the power of the government has been going on for 5,000 years. The government almost always wins, except when a determined minority lights a bonfire of liberty, as the radicals did in 1776, when they threw off the king and the mightiest army on the planet. I am not suggesting bloodshed, but I'm suggesting courage and strength and a willingness to tolerate the intolerable in order to manifest and defend the freedom for the rest of us. I don't know how this ends. I'm looking at young people shaking their heads and agreeing with me. Your generation will have to make ugly choices. I believe that when I die, I will die in my bedroom, in my house, surrounded by those who love me, faithful to first principles. But not all of you will have that luxury. Some of you will die faithful to first principles in a government prison. And some of you will die faithful to first principles in a government town square to the sound of the government's trumpets blaring. When the time comes to make those awful decisions, you will know what to do, because freedom lies in the human heart. And while it is there, no army, no dictator, no majority, no crowd can take it away. But like any good muscle, it must do more than just lie there. Thank you, and God love you.
And Judge Napolitano, hey, paisano! Freedom, 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 freedom. That's it, freedom. And speaking about freedom, and how our freedom's been stolen from us, the banksters, the bankster gang, boy, they like to grab everything that they could grab from us. Before we introduce the next speaker about the banksters, I also want to, Anthony Frieda, who spoke those very kind words, he's the artist that does all the work on the Trends journals that are blowouts. So thank you, Anthony, for all that you do.